Hello, and welcome to the planning process for the 2021 to 2025 New York State Historic Preservation Plan. The purpose of this video is to provide members of the public and interested parties with an overview of the state's planning services and information about the planning process. The New York State Historic Preservation Plan is prepared by the State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation. Specifically, the Office's Division for Historic Preservation is required to prepare this plan every 5 years by their partners at the National Park Service. It is important to note that this plan is not designed to organize the division's workflow. Rather, the purpose of the plan is to provide a guiding tool for all New Yorkers to use for the purpose of preserving, protecting, and revitalizing our state's historic resources. Fundamental to the successful achievement of the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation is the dedication of our employees and the adherence to a common set of values. These guiding principles serve as a pledge to the people we serve and a commitment to ourselves and to each other. Although there have been many efforts to preserve American history, what is known as the modern preservation movement began in earnest as a response to the nation's mid-century policies of urban renewal. An early milestone in the preservation movement began with the creation of the New York City Landmarks Commission. This occurred after the 1963 demolition of New York City's Penn Station and the overwhelming public response to the loss of the building. Since 1965, the Landmarks Commission has been tasked with designating historic resources locally and protecting them through the building permit process. The following year, President Johnson signed the National Historic Preservation Act, which established the National Register of Historic Places designation program and a national network of state historic preservation offices, or SHPOs as they're commonly known. The purpose of the Act and the SHPOs is to offer a measure of protection for National Register of Historic Places listed and eligible sites when federal funds, licensing, or permitting are involved in an undertaking. New York State followed with a complementary State Historic Preservation Act in 1980. Since the creation of the Acts, the preservation movement and the SHPOs have evolved significantly. Many local governments have enacted preservation commissions, which remain one of the most effective tools for protecting historic sites. New York State is host to several statewide, regional, and local not-for-profit historic preservation advocacy organizations, and preservation has been integrated into numerous planning processes as a tool for smart growth and sustainability. The New York SHPO is one of the nation's largest and has been effective in leveraging the tools established through the National Park Service and New York State. New York is the leader in listings on the National Register and in its use of the federal 20% Rehabilitation Tax Credit Program. The SHPO is contained within the New York State Office of Parks, Recreation, and Historic Preservation's Division for Historic Preservation, which additionally oversees New York's historic sites system. The Division for Historic Preservation is divided into 3 bureaus: the Bureau of Technical Preservation Services and the Bureau of Community Preservation Services contain the SHPO function. The Bureau of Historic Sites and Park Services works with New York State's park regions to help interpret and curate historic sites, while also working to provide conservation of the sites and their vast collections. The Bureau of Historic Sites provides technical support and museum services to New York's historic sites and historic parks. New York State created the first publicly owned historic site in the nation when it purchased Washington's headquarters in Newburgh in 1850. Today, there are 41 designated historic sites and historic parks, representing many time periods and subjects in the history of New York and the nation. Curators, conservators, and collections managers care for the hundreds of thousands of artifacts belonging to the people of the state of New York. The unit not only keeps track of and protects every single object and its history, but it also uses the collection to create exhibits, to perform research, and to help set the scene in the rooms at historic house museums. The collections include archaeological objects, paintings, furniture, historic books, textiles, decorative arts, sculptures, wagons, cannons, and archival material. These important objects can date from the prehistoric to the 20th century. New York State has one of only a few facilities in the nation with conservators from multiple disciplines under one roof. Conservators prepare objects for exhibition, uphold museum standards for environmental monitoring, carry out needed repairs, and conduct scientific investigations of the collections. The Interpretive Services Unit helps the historic sites and parks with research and works with sites to develop tours and educational programming. The unit includes historians, graphic artists, interpretation specialists, and a full exhibit shop that creates programs, signs, exhibits, and publications tailored to the historic sites. Many of the programs that the public interacts with the most frequently begin in the Community Preservation Services Bureau. The first stop in the New York State Historic Preservation Office tends to be with the Survey and Evaluation Unit. These are the folks that help us determine what is and is not defined as historic by the definitions set by the National Park Service. The National Park Service provides criteria for the evaluation of eligibility for the National Register of Historic Places. The SHPO's Survey and National Register Unit applies the criteria during the formal evaluation of potential historic resources. While listing and eligibility on the register offer a measure of protection for a historic resource, it does not prevent a resource from being demolished or altered if project funds, licensing, or permitting are outside the jurisdiction of New York State and the federal government. Register listing is, however, a requirement for many preservation-based incentive programs, such as New York State's Environmental Protection Fund grants and rehabilitation tax incentives. A community does not have to apply the Park Service standards when determining what they find to be historic. However, it is a nationally accepted model and often a benchmark for communities seeking to preserve their historic resources. The SHPO's National Register and Survey Unit ultimately help facilitate community surveys of historic resources, evaluate register status for review under the Preservation Acts, certifies properties for use in tax credit programs, and helps sponsors to facilitate listings on historic registers. The Bureau's Community Engagement Unit offers a variety of incentives and support programs available through New York State and the National Park Service. These programs include the Certified Local Government and Home Ownership Tax Credit programs, as well as coordination of state and federal grant incentives. The Engagement Unit additionally works with colleague organizations to advance preservation issues and plan programming for the public. The Certified Local Government Program, or CLG program, offers support to local preservation commissions. While there are 72 CLG communities throughout New York State, there are many more that are outside of the CLG program. CLG designation requires that a local commission has an enacted preservation law that meets the best practices set by the National Park Service. Designation as a CLG offers municipalities the opportunity to apply for funding made available by the National Park Service to advance local preservation efforts. It is worth noting that local preservation ordinance and designation provides the best level of protection for a historic resource. While historic registers offer a measure of protection under the Preservation Acts, the best tool for protection of a historic property is administered by a municipality and its historic commission. The Environmental Protection Program provides funding for eligible municipalities and not-for-profits to restore or acquire historic properties. These properties must be listed on the registers. The SHPO's Engagement Unit additionally assists sponsors with applications to federal grant programs, such as the Park Service's Underrepresented Communities Grant Program and Hurricane Sandy Relief Subgrant Program. The New York State Homeownership Tax Credit Program is a partnership with New York State's Department of Taxation and Finance. The incentive offers a 20% tax credit for rehabilitation expenditures of owner-occupied historic properties. To be eligible, the property must be listed on the New York State Register, and access to the program is limited to census tracts that are at or below the state median family income. Eligible owners apply before the work is undertaken. SHPO staff in the engagement unit work with owners to ensure that their projects adhere to the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehabilitation. Once the project has been completed, a final approval allows owners to apply for the credit when filing their New York State taxes. For households earning under $60,000, the credit may be taken as a refund. A response to the previous preservation plan was the need to address the lack of skilled craftspeople to undertake historic rehabilitation. The New York SHPO has actively been developing a series of courses in the preservation trades. Currently, the program is available in the Capital Region through Hudson Valley Community College's Workforce Development Institute and in Western New York through the not-for-profit organization Preservation Buffalo Niagara. If you are interested in learning more about the program or expanding the program in your service area, please contact the Engagement Unit for more information. The Technical Preservation Bureau is comprised of trained archaeologists and building conservators. Their roles span from the identification of archaeologically sensitive areas to the review of buildings for their adherence to the Secretary of Interior's standards. The division's team of building conservators work with project sponsors when buildings are determined eligible or listed on the National Register. Earlier in this program, we mentioned the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehabilitation. Similar to the criteria for National Register evaluation, the National Park Service provides guidance for the proper treatment of historic resources. When a project is proposed to the division, whether it is for a review under the Preservation Acts or for a commercial tax credit, the technical services and compliance staff review those projects for adherence to the standards. While it is impossible that all buildings remain the same throughout the lifetime of their use, the technical staff mitigates the potential impacts to a historic structure. Their reviews can include the review of building additions, upgrades, treatments, and in the case where a building cannot be saved, they review structural documents and may request alternatives to demolition. Since the 1970s, the federal government has provided a tax incentive to rehabilitate historic commercial properties. The current iteration of the federal program offers a 20% tax credit for qualified expenditures for National Register-listed buildings. In 2007, New York State enacted a companion 20% tax credit program. In order to take the additional 20% credit from New York State, the project must additionally be approved for the federal credit program and be listed in a qualifying census tract. Projects must adhere to the Secretary of Interior's standards for rehabilitation. A technical team from the SHPO provides boots-on-the-ground support for project sponsors and acts as a project liaison for partners at the National Park Service. The commercial program is perhaps one of the SHPO's most well-known programs. Since 2011, the program has leveraged $7 billion towards the rehabilitation of National Register-listed buildings, and 2/3 of that investment has come from upstate New York. Often when people think of preservation, they think of buildings. But archaeology is a critical part of the preservation of New York's historic resources and the SHPO mission. Just like a building, the archaeology unit evaluates the potential impacts to archaeological sites. Under the Preservation Acts, when a project involves ground disturbance, which includes new construction, the site is sent to the archaeology team to review for archaeological sensitivity. When a site is determined archaeologically sensitive, the team evaluates whether or not testing is required at the site. The results of this testing have created a vast inventory of archaeological reports about pre- and post-contact sites in New York State. The New York SHPO has been at the forefront of developing new technology for the management of historic resources. The Cultural Resource Information System, or CRIS, is a GIS-based software that places register-listed and register-eligible sites geospatially. CRIS records information about individual buildings, historic districts, archaeological sites, and projects that have been reviewed by the SHPO. Hundreds of thousands of pieces of information from the SHPO archives have been uploaded into CRIS, and the public is able to access that information via the portal. An added benefit of this software program is near elimination of paper submissions to the SHPO and accelerated review times for projects seeking approval under the Preservation Acts. Now that you've reviewed the wealth of functions and responsibilities of the New York State Historic Preservation Office and the Division for Historic Preservation, we'd like to walk you through the planning process and the development of the 2021 to 2025 State Historic Preservation Plan. Again, this plan is not designed to organize the division's workflow. Rather, the purpose of the plan is to provide a guiding tool for all New Yorkers to use for the purpose of preserving, protecting, and revitalizing our state's historic and cultural resources. So why do we spend the time and energy on planning? Well, we plan because good planning leads to better outcomes. A deliberate planning process provides a rational, systematic approach to collect and analyze data and information that ensures our vision, goals, and priorities are responsive to community values and the needs of New York State's historic and cultural resources. Through a thoughtful planning process, we can make timely recommendations for improvement or expansion of actions designed to provide for the diversity of historic and cultural resources found across the state. We also plan because planning is an iterative, inclusionary process, one that facilitates our ability to tap into the wellspring of knowledge of subject matter experts, partner organizations, and members of the public. This collaboration builds consensus and ensures we all diligently work toward a common goal with purpose. You may already be familiar with another substantial planning effort led by this agency, the Statewide Comprehensive Outdoor Recreation Plan, a document more commonly known as SCORP. The SCORP serves as a guide for public outdoor recreation policy across the state. It is a planning tool for use in decision-making as it identifies current and future recreation trends. Content for the report is developed based on surveys distributed in every county of the state. The results of the survey help the agency to understand public perception of recreation facilities, identify how people are using them, and establish outdoor recreation priorities. Like the State Historic Preservation Plan, the SCORP is produced every 5 years and ensures New York State is eligible for funding from the Federal Land and Water Conservation Fund. The preparation and implementation of a statewide historic preservation plan is mandated by the National Historic Preservation Act and necessary for New York State to receive appropriations from the Federal Historic Preservation Fund. In New York State, plans are generally prepared every 5 years. Most recently, plans were prepared in 2009 and 2015. The State Historic Preservation Plan is significant in that it informs decision-making that impacts our state's historic and cultural resources. The plan helps to influence the development and adoption of policy locally, regionally, and statewide. Last but not least, the plan empowers individuals, local organizations, and communities, providing them with a thoughtful, nuanced plan for implementation, one that is sensitive to the values of New Yorkers across the state and the diversity of their resources. The State Historic Preservation Plan consists of 4 key chapters. The first chapter is a summary of the planning process. This chapter tells readers the logistics behind plan preparation, the persons and organizations involved in the planning process, including a narrative on how public input was gathered, and identifies how the State Historic Preservation Office intends to implement the plan. The second chapter is an assessment of the condition of known historic and cultural resources. This chapter analyzes existing historic and cultural resource data, identifying gaps and potential needs. Are certain resource types, historic contexts, or regions missing, underrepresented, or threatened in New York State? Findings from this analysis help to shape survey questions, in-depth conversations with colleagues, and other data collection efforts that serve as the basis for goal setting and help to determine planning priorities in the next 5 years. The third chapter, Goals and Objectives, is responsive to identified resource needs, the issues, threats, and opportunities surrounding historic and cultural resources in the state, and feedback received from stakeholders throughout the planning process. The plan's goals and objectives will be realistic and feasible, actions that can reasonably be accomplished during the lifespan of the plan. The final chapter is the Generic Environmental Impact Statement. The Generic Environmental Impact Statement discusses in general terms the potential cumulative environmental impacts of the plan. This impact statement is prepared in accordance with the State Environmental Quality Review Act. This agency's approach to planning is based on 3 fundamental principles. 1. Planning is a continuous process. Planning does not produce a set-in-stone blueprint for the future. An effective plan requires that assumptions, methods, and objectives are periodically re-examined, and new factors and information are incorporated as conditions change. 2. Planning must be comprehensive. To be effective, the information and research base supporting the planning process must consider a complete range of human activity. 3. Planning must be a coordinated process with public participation. Effective planning for public agencies must include the opportunity for citizen participation and input. The graph presented here on your screen focuses on the human, community-based approach to planning used by this agency and identifies the key actors in the planning process. The primary group of individuals involved in the planning process for the development of the State Historic Preservation Plan is collectively called the core team. The core team is comprised of professional staff from the agency's Division for Historic Preservation and its Division of Environmental Stewardship and Planning. Involvement in the core team is represented by leadership and staff from the Bureau of Historic Sites and Parks, the Bureau of Community Preservation Services, which includes the Survey, Evaluation, and National Register Unit, as well as the Community Engagement Unit, the Bureau of Technical Preservation Services, which includes the Archaeology Unit, and several other professional staff across the two divisions. A second group of individuals involved in the planning process are collectively known as resource experts, a wide range of public, private, and professional persons and organizations with experience or interest in planning, community development, historic preservation, landscape, architecture, education, archaeology, cultural heritage resiliency, and New York State history. These individuals are consulted by the core team throughout the planning process and invited to weigh in on the overall vision for the plan, identify key preservation issues the state currently faces, and help develop a comprehensive list of preservation planning goals with specific strategies and actions to reach them during the coming 5 years. And last but not least, public input is paramount to the success of the plan. Early and continuous public involvement in a planning process ensures that decisions consider diverse viewpoints and values, reflect public interests, and that goals and objectives are made in collaboration with all stakeholders. The Division for Historic Preservation and the Division of Environmental Stewardship and Planning are working together to provide multiple opportunities for engagement and participation in the development of the State Historic Preservation Plan. Currently, we are conducting a survey across the state of more than 3,000 members of the general public to gauge attitudes towards preservation and historic sites. We are hosting calls with colleague groups to have open, in-depth conversations about experiences in the field, current trends and needs, and thoughts about the future. Complementary to these initiatives, we are making an extra effort to reach out to individuals, groups, and communities underrepresented in preservation and cultural resource management. In the near future, we will be promoting a survey to colleague and advocacy groups, as well as others with general interest in the future of preservation and historic sites, to help us to develop an even richer data set with which to inform the plan and its priorities for implementation over the next 5 years. The Division for Historic Preservation and Division of Environmental Stewardship and Planning are determined to provide meaningful opportunities to participate in the plan's creation. We want to ensure the document is beneficial to decision makers and preservation advocates, that it is inclusionary and attuned to the needs of communities and their inimitable historic and cultural resources. It is only with public input that we can strengthen the integration of historic preservation into broader public policy and build capacity to support preservation and historic sites initiatives statewide. As mentioned earlier in this presentation, the State Historic Preservation Plan will include a chapter that provides a summary assessment of existing and current conditions of the variety of historic and cultural resources across New York State. This assessment of resources includes the identification of important issues, threats, and opportunities that may affect each resource type. A substantial list of the resources evaluated in the plan is presented on this slide. A methodical planning process informed by a myriad of stakeholders allows us to develop SMART goals and objectives, ones that are specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely. The successful development of SMART goals and objectives will encourage broad public participation in planning for historic and cultural resources, meet challenges unique to New York State, influence historic preservation policy and government at all levels, and empower local communities, organizations, and individuals to action. In accordance with the State Environmental Quality Review Act, most projects or activities proposed by a state agency or unit of local government in New York State require an assessment of environmental impacts. This environmental assessment is an evaluation from the outset of environmental considerations that may factor into planning, review, and decision-making processes surrounding a plan or project. For the State Historic Preservation Plan, the agency is preparing a generic Environmental Impact Statement, or GEIS. A GEIS is written more broadly than an Environmental Impact Statement for a specific project would be, as the statewide plan is comprehensive in nature, has wide application, and will influence a range of future policies and projects. The State Historic Preservation Plan will be approved by the National Park Service, subject to the plan's conformance with the National Historic Preservation Act and the Secretary of Interior standards. Prior to approval, the Park Service may solicit comments on the plan from reviewers that regularly perform work for other preservation programs under its administration. Reviewers may be from the Park Service's National Register of Historic Places program, tax incentive programs, the Historic Preservation Fund, and/or the American Battlefield Protection Program. This slide captures a general timeline for the development of the State Historic Preservation Plan. The core team began the planning process at the beginning of 2020, working behind the scenes to collect and analyze existing data on our historic and cultural resource inventories. The official public kickoff for the document, however, starts this month, May, which also happens to be National Historic Preservation Month. Throughout the spring, the core team will be surveying and conducting interviews with preservation colleagues and advocates, as well as distributing a general population survey to gauge general attitudes towards preservation and cultural resource management. Throughout the late spring and into the early summer, the core team will analyze the wealth of data it collected from persons across the state to help inform the development of plan goals and objectives. The team is working toward completing its first draft of the plan in the late summer. This draft plan will be released for public comment for a minimum of 30 days. We encourage all interested persons to review the draft document and comment on the work product. The team is working toward releasing the final State Historic Preservation Plan, a document approved by both the New York State Parks Commissioner and the National Park Service, by the end of 2020. Cumulatively, the State Historic Preservation Plan will cost millions of dollars to implement. The pace and sequencing of actions recommended in the plan will be determined in the future by the availability of funding, which is a function of the size of the agency's annual capital budget, state and federal legislative actions, as well as the availability of staff and planning resources. To fully implement the recommendations outlined in the plan, specific and programmatic actions will need to be developed, as well as performance metrics that translate goals and strategies into the measurable delivery of preservation services and programs. Colleague groups and individuals, and the development of partnerships among them, are essential to successful plan implementation. Whether you represent a not-for-profit organization, a private firm, or are someone that cares deeply about the history of our state, your continued interest in preservation and cultural resource management is necessary to the advancement of plan, goals, and objectives in the next 5 years. Your contributions, from providing operational support to visiting historic sites or museums with friends and family, undertaking fundraising campaigns, seeking redevelopment incentives, and the numerous other activities that help in the stewardship of historic and cultural resources, do not go unnoticed. These efforts are invaluable undertakings that enrich the diversity and excellence of preservation activity and cultural resource management throughout New York State. Thank you for watching this presentation and for your interest in the development of the 2021 to 2025 New York State Historic Preservation Plan. We want to leave you with this slide and encourage you to join our mailing list to stay apprised of upcoming opportunities to participate in this planning effort. You may also send to this email address any questions you have about the plan or its process. Approximately 2 weeks after this presentation is first posted, we will prepare a document summarizing any substantive questions we receive and post responses to those questions in a document made available on the agency's website. We also encourage you to participate in our New York State Preservation Colleague Survey and to share this survey with anyone interested in the future of preservation and historic sites in New York State. The link to the survey is included on this slide. The information gathered from your survey responses are critical to this planning effort and the creation of a productive, forward-thinking plan that best serves the historic and cultural resources of our state. The Division for Historic Preservation and Division of Environmental Stewardship and Planning are determined to provide you with meaningful opportunities to participate in the plan's development. We want to ensure the document is beneficial to decision makers and preservation advocates, that it is inclusionary and attuned to the needs of your community and its irreplaceable historic and cultural resources. It is only with your input that we can strengthen the integration of historic preservation into broader public policy and build capacity to support preservation initiatives statewide. Again, thank you for your time and have a great day.